Hey guys, in this lesson, I will cover AWS CodePipeline. So what is CodePipeline? CodePipeline is a service that we can use for creating CI/CD pipelines. It's a continuous delivery service, so when we're using continuous integration and continuous delivery or continuous deployment, this is the service that helps us to bring everything together and create the automated pipeline. So we have an AWS CodePipeline. Within the pipeline, we create stages. For example, a stage could be a source code stage for our GitHub repository. It could be a build and test stage for building and testing our code, and that might use AWS CodeBuild as the service that we integrate. But it doesn't have to be CodeBuild. It doesn't have to be AWS. There are other options as well. And then for the deployment, here we're using CodeDeploy. So this is to deploy the code out to the actual application. So we have a code pipeline. Within that, we can create our build, test, and deploy phases for whatever release process it is that we want to implement. So when there are code changes, how do we want those to go through the various stages of being synchronized into a repository, pushed through to a build and test service and tested, and then ultimately out to the end application, perhaps with some manual approval stages or some other kind of approval actually happening as part of the pipeline as well. So here we've got GitHub as the source code, CodeBuild for doing the build and test. Then we've got a manual approval step, and then CodeDeploy to push through to the running application. So the developer commits the code to the repository. The code is then pushed through to CodeBuild, so CodePipeline is causing that event trigger to happen. Then it goes to manual approval. So now you could actually have someone checking and approving it at the right time after it's actually passed the relevant human checks, as well as the automated checks that happen through the CodeBuild. So we have an approver approving the updates, and then they're pushed through to CodeDeploy, which actually deploys the actual updates to the code out to the application. So what are the possible integrations? There's lots of different AWS and third-party integrations for the various different stages in a pipeline. For instance, for the source stage, we can have our code in S3, in ECR, in GitHub, in GitLab, in Bitbucket, and more. For the build stage, we can actually run shell commands, or we can use CodeBuild, ECR, or Jenkins. For test, CodeBuild, Device Farm, Jenkins, Ghost Inspector UI testing, Micro Focus, Storm Runner Load, Run Scope API monitoring, and this list changes from time to time, so it may not be accurate. When we get into the actual console, you'll be able to see what the current integrations are at the time of you going in and actually building your pipeline. For the deployment stage, we've got a variety of options as well: app config, CloudFormation, CodeDeploy, ECS, Elastic Beanstalk, AWS Service Catalog, S3, and Alexa Skills Kit at this particular time. So let's cover some of the concepts. We have pipelines. This is a workflow that describes how software changes go through the release process. Each pipeline is made up of a series of stages. There are two types of pipeline you can create: a V1 type pipeline, which has a JSON structure and contains standard pipeline stage and action level parameters, and then the V2 type, which has some additional options for release safety and trigger configuration. We have artifacts as well, so these are the files or changes that are going to be worked on by the actions and stages in the pipeline. Each pipeline stage can create its own artifacts. They are passed and stored in S3 and then passed on to the next stage. Examples might include your source code, your built applications, dependencies, definition files, templates, and more. Then we have stages. So pipelines are broken up into stages. For example, source, that is our source code repository where our code changes are committed. Then we have build, where our changes are built. So that can mean, for example, compiling our code, and it can also mean running some tests on the code as well. Then we've got stages, so the code is deployed and tested in a staging environment, for example. And we might add that stage before we go through to deployment to actual productions. So we can build our own customized pipelines depending on our specific requirements. Each stage can have sequential actions and or parallel actions. And for example, our stages would be source, build, test, deploy, load test, etc. We can also define manual approval at any stage. Another concept is actions. Stages contain at least one action, such as a source action from a code change, where a developer is committing a change of the code to the code base, or an action for deploying the actual application to instances. Actions can affect artifacts and will have their own artifacts as either input or output or both. Transitions are the progression from one stage to another inside of a pipeline. Pipeline executions are the actual execution of a set of changes released by a pipeline, and each has its own unique ID. So here, for example, an execution would be where the developer has committed the code, pushed it through to the repository. That change has then triggered the pipeline. So that will create an execution of the pipeline. That execution may be that the entire pipeline is used, so the code ends up being deployed right out to the actual application. Or maybe it fails, or maybe it results in the developer getting some feedback that they need to make some changes because the build and test phase didn't actually complete successfully. All of those would still be executions. So an execution corresponds to a set of changes such as a merged commit or a manual release of the latest commit. Two executions can release the same set of changes at different times as well. So to summarize, CodePipeline gives us a way to integrate various different AWS and third-party services that represent the different stages of the release process and create the relevant automations between one stage and another. And here's just an example of some of the options that we've discussed earlier in terms of the different AWS and third-party services that you can integrate into different stages.